Ron woke up, another Tuesday. The alarm clock's shrill beep echoed in his ears, a cruel reminder of the day ahead. He showered, the hot water barely cutting through the fog in his head. The steam enveloped him, but it did little to clear his mind. A dull throb pulsed behind his eyes, growing stronger with each passing minute. Must have been the cheap whiskey last night, he thought, regretting the last few drinks he had before bed. Ron shrugged it off. He had a job to do, and there was no time to dwell on his discomfort. The day dragged on. Numbers swam on the screen, blurring together in a confusing mess. The headache lingered, a persistent hum in the background of his thoughts, making concentration nearly impossible. Ron popped a couple of aspirin, hoping for relief. No use. The pain remained, stubborn and unyielding. He pushed through, counting down the minutes until he could escape the fluorescent lights and lose himself in a bottle of something strong. The clock seemed to move slower than usual. By Wednesday, the headache had intensified. It was no longer just a dull throb, but a sharp, relentless pain. It felt like a vice slowly tightening around his skull, squeezing harder with each passing hour. Ron's usual cheerful demeanor was gone, replaced by a grimace and a short temper. He snapped at colleagues over minor issues. His colleagues gave him a wide berth, sensing something was off. They whispered among themselves, worried about his sudden change in behavior. That night, as Ron lay in bed, a new sound reached his ears. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder. A faint scratching, like tiny claws on wood, echoed through the silence of the night. It was a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He sat up, listening intently. Silence enveloped the room once more, but the unease lingered. He dismissed it as the house settling and rolled over, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in his head. Sleep was elusive, slipping through his grasp. The next day, the scratching returned. It was no longer a faint whisper, but a persistent noise that gnawed at his sanity. It was louder now, more insistent, demanding his attention. It seemed to be a part of his very being. It seemed to be coming from inside his head, a relentless intruder that he couldn't escape. Ron shook his head, trying to dislodge the sound. It wouldn't go away. It clung to him, a shadow he couldn't shake. A cold fear began to creep up his spine. His concentration was shot. Every task became a struggle against the noise. The scratching continued relentlessly, a maddening counterpoint to the pounding in his head. It was as if his mind was being slowly eroded. Ron's world shrank to the confines of his own skull, a prison of pain and sound. The once familiar world around him faded, leaving only the torment within. Thursday night, sleep was impossible. The scratching was relentless, a chorus of tiny claws tearing at his sanity. Ron paced his apartment, his mind racing. He tried everything, music, television, even stuffing cotton in his ears. Nothing worked. The headache was unbearable now, a constant searing pain. Ron felt himself slipping, his grip on reality weakening. He knew he needed help. He had to find out what was happening before it was too late. Friday morning, Ron stumbled into the doctor's office, a shadow of his former self. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He explained his symptoms, his voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with sharp eyes, listened patiently. "The scratching," Ron croaked. "It's driving me mad." The doctor examined his ears, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't see anything out of the ordinary," she murmured. "Let's take a closer look." She picked up an instrument, a thin metal probe with a light at the end, her hand steady but her eyes betraying a hint of concern. As she gently inserted it into Ron's ear, the scratching reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of tiny claws scraping against his eardrum. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard magnified 1,000 times. Ron screamed, a primal sound of pure terror, his body convulsing with the intensity of the pain and fear. "What is it? What's wrong with me?" he gasped, tears streaming down his face, his voice cracking with desperation. The doctor froze, her eyes widening in horror, unable to comprehend the sight before her. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely able to get the words out. "Mr. Jones, there are spiders!" She could hardly believe it herself, the words sounding surreal even as she spoke them. Ron stared at her, his blood turning to ice. "Spiders? What do you mean, spiders?" The doctor took a deep breath, her face pale. "There's an infestation. Tiny spiders. They've hatched inside your head. Ron's vision swam, the scratching intensified, a symphony of horror as the spiders, disturbed by the examination, swarmed inside his skull. He felt a sharp pain, like 1,000 tiny needles piercing his brain. The room spun, and then everything went black.